Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
My guest today is Professor Art Markman, who is a professor of psychology, human dimensions of organizations, and marketing at the University of Texas at Austin, and exec director of the IC2 Institute. He has written over 150 scholarly papers on topics including reasoning, decision-making, and motivation. He is author of several books, including Smart Thinking, Smart Change, Brain Briefs, and Bring Your Brain to Work. Welcome, Art.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
I want to start with some of your older papers in the area of decision-making. And one of them is entitled Taking More Now. The optimality of impulsive choice hinges on environment structure, in which you say impulsivity is a stable personality trait associated with myopic choice behavior that favors immediate rewards over larger delayed rewards, and is often characterized as maladaptive inside and outside of the lab. An alternative view suggests that the consequences of trait impulsivity depend on the nature of the task environment. You want to talk a bit about that? So you have some experiments run in this context?
Yeah. So let's just start with the big picture for a second.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about the kinds of characteristics that we see across our population, there's usually some adaptive value to that range of variation. And so when we think about impulsivity, this tendency to want to get the best thing I can get right now, rather than waiting for something in the future, we often think of impulsivity as being a negative characteristic.
Yeah.
We reward people for staying in school, for working hard on a project rather than having fun right now. So we think of it as, so then you could ask yourself, well, if it's such a negative characteristic, why is it still around? Why have we not moved people all in the direction of favoring what happens in the future? And so to really explore that, we took advantage of a somewhat complicated task, but in which you make a series of decisions, and it's a simple decision. You have two options,
yeah,
and you're going to get a payoff for those options. And the way that the task is structured is that on any given trial, one of the options gives you a better payoff than the other.
Mm-hmm.
But on the basis of what you select now, the overall state of the world changes.
Hmm.
So that when you consistently pick the option that's better now, it makes the world worse in the long run. So the overall quality of the options declines when you pick the better option. And when you pick the worse option now, the overall state of the world gets better so that the options get better.
Interesting.
And what's interesting about setting things up like that is, on the one hand, you can begin to look at to what degree are people biased to pick the shiny thing, the better option now, versus the thing that creates a better world in the long run. And what you find is that trait impulsivity is correlated with that. The more impulsive you are, the more that you tend to pick the better option now, even though it makes the world worse. And then you could ask the question, so what is the optimal strategy? And it turns out the answer to that question is it depends on the nature of the world that you're in. So if by making the state of the world better, in the long run, you actually create a better overall world, then picking the worst thing now is a good idea. But there's also situations in which the world may get better, but it's never going to get so much better that you're better off picking the worse option.
Right.
And so what's interesting is that the impulsive people pick the option that's better now in both of those environments, and the less impulsive people pick the option that makes the world get better in all of those environments. But in some of those environments, actually, the impulsive people are the ones who end up doing better. And so one of the things it tells us is look around the world a little bit. Sometimes there's some other research by Dan Ariely suggesting that people often overwork and over-earn relative to their needs.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons that happens is because those of us who are less impulsive train ourselves that we have to do the thing that's right in the long term. And you know what? Every once in a while, it's actually okay to stop and smell the roses.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, so many different things there. So one is uncertainty. How
Right.
you internalize uncertainty into the decision-making process.
Right.
And the other is sort of weighing the incremental benefits, right? So if you're already reasonably good state of the world, then the incremental benefits that's going to accrue by marginally making it better is lower, right? So what you're saying is that when we train ourselves, correct me if I'm wrong, Art, when we train ourselves to be less impulsive, in some cases, the decisions we make is not really rational. That's what it sounds to me, right?
That's right. That's right. Because we stop paying attention to what our actual goal ought to be, and we substitute a proxy for that, which is a rule that says, delay your gratification, do the thing that's right in the long term, without asking yourself, is that actually the right thing to do in this environment?
Yeah, and the other thing about impulsivity is that it might be a bit correlated with innovation, right? So again, you can look at, certain cultures where you very actively discourage impulsive behaviors tend to have fairly high academic, or I should call it academic accomplishments on paper, but not necessarily high innovation. And I wondered if there's a correlation there too.
Yeah, I think one of the other things we could say about this is that it's one of the reasons why we want variability in the population is because it allows us also to create groups in which there's some heterogeneity in the underlying characteristics, and you'd like to have a little bit of that tension. So if you have an organization, an academic organization is a great example of that, in which everyone is into the delay of gratification, then you may never actually try to move forward with a real world project that may need to get done, it's useful to have a few people out there who actually want to just go after it right now.
Right.
Now, you don't want an organization that's filled only with impulsive people, because they can make a series of short-term choices that may actually make it difficult for the organization to succeed in the long run. And so a lot of what you want is to create a team in which you have that creative tension in it, where you have some people dragging you towards, hey, let's get something done, but another group that's saying, you know what, we also need to be careful in the way that we're doing this, and then to balance those forces.
Right. Yeah. I want to jump into another paper. So this is called, there are at least two kinds of probability matching, evidence from a secondary task.
Yeah.
So you say probability matching is a suboptimal behavior that often plagues human decision-making in simple repeated choice tasks.
Yeah.
Despite decades of research, recent studies cannot find agreement on what choice strategies lead to probability matching. Now, probability matching is some sort of heuristics that you are using from history or past experiences in making a decision.
Yeah, that's right. So let's think of it in the barest case that we tend to use in experiments, and then I can give you a suggestion for how you might see this in the world.
Yeah.
In studies, what you tend to do is to say, okay, here, let's say you've got two options, and on any given trial of the experiment, you're going to choose one of those two options, and one of those options is going to get rewarded, or those options are going to be rewarded with a particular probability. So let's say I have one option that's rewarded 70% of the time, and the other is rewarded 30% of the time.
Yeah.
What you find in studies consistently is that people tend to engage in what's called probability matching, in which their probability of selecting each option mirrors the underlying probability of a reward. So you end up picking the option that's rewarded 70% of the time, 70% of the time, and the option that's rewarded 30% of the time, you end up picking that 30% of the time,
regardless of the size of the reward.
Well, that's right. Regardless of the size of the reward, you focus on that probability. And the reason that that's a suboptimal strategy is that once you determine what the underlying probability of reward is, you should always pick the option that's most likely to be rewarded, because that will maximize the likelihood of getting rewarded, even though on some trials you're not going to get rewarded.
Right.
And so that's the paradox that people have tried to explain. And the idea is, it's interesting. We see correct behavior, this kind of maximizing behavior, in some people when they do things like go to restaurants. So if you have a restaurant that you like to go to, say a place you go to for lunch often, you may find that you or people will actually order the same thing every single time you go there. And you might think to yourself, well, that's a strange behavior. But if there's a particular dish at that restaurant you really like, well, then you are picking the optimal thing for yourself each time.
Right.
And so that's a maximizing kind of behavior. But there are plenty of situations in which we don't do that. We sometimes go to the best store for something, but then sometimes go to a less good store in kind of, in the order of its goodness. And what that does is to create suboptimal decisions in some cases. Although, as a side note, I'll say one of the reasons that we tend to do that is because the world is actually dynamic. And so there's the options themselves can change over time in the real world. And so we don't necessarily want to get locked into doing the same thing every time, because it may very well be that the option we keep choosing gets worse over time, or maybe other options get better. If I always go to the same restaurant, who knows, a great place might open up the street, or a restaurant that wasn't so good might get a new chef and now be better. And so a little bit of exploration actually turns out to be valuable.
Yeah, so let me understand this, Art. So the two options you described, one has a 70% chance of occurring, other has 30%. If I have rewards, let's say $1,000 for the 30% option,
Yeah.
my probability adjusted outcome there is 300. And I have only $100 reward for the 70% of the time. The probability adjusted outcome is 70. What you're saying is that people tend to choose the 70% option by probability matching. And it's a suboptimal decision because probability adjusted outcomes is substantially less there compared to the 30% option.
Well, actually, the way that these studies work tends to be a little bit different. So
Okay.
let's say that on every trial, you could get a $100 reward,
Yeah.
but you'll only get that $100 reward if you pick the button that's being rewarded on that trial. And so one button gets the reward 70% of the time, one button gets it 30% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
The optimal thing to do would be to pick let's say that the left-hand button is the one that gets the 70%, is rewarded 70% of the time. The optimal strategy is, once you figure that out, always pick the left-hand button and get your reward, your $100 reward 70% of the time.
Okay.
But what actually happens is that you end up picking that button 70% of the time
Okay.
and the other button 30% of the time. And if you were to multiply out all of the probabilities there, you would discover that you're making less
Right.
than the 70% at $100.
Right. Yeah. So sort of exploration is is wired in.
That's right. That's right. And it turns out, and the point of this particular paper was that there are actually two ways you can get to that strategy. One of which is a kind of real robotic strategy that's called win, stay, lose, shift, where basically you pick an option, and if you get rewarded, you pick that option again, and if you don't, you pick the other option. And that doesn't really require you to pay attention to much, and it does lead to probability matching behavior. But the other possibility is that you're actually tracking the underlying statistics of the world, and then picking based on those underlying statistics. And what we got was evidence that under different conditions, people will use one or the other of those strategies. And in particular, if you make it hard for people to hold on to much information at any given time, right, then they revert back to this more robotic win, stay, lose, shift strategy. And the reason why this matters is because if you're actually going to understand the real world, you don't just want to do things in a robotic way. You'd actually like to have a pretty clear sense of, well, this client is reliable, this percentage of the time, and this client is only reliable this percentage of the time. You'd like to actually have an internal mental model of that. And if you don't have that, then it makes it hard to do complex decision making in the future.
Yeah, this is also, I wondered, Art, it has some societal implications, right? So as we move forward with artificial intelligence and other technologies, a very naive machine learning algorithm will always reach optimality in situations like this. It will never have, the human-like failure, so to speak, right? And so in a world where machines make most of the routine decisions, many of this consumer human-driven judgments that result in errors might not be there. So that has implications for, I think, how companies think about their products and other types of things in the future, I think.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. Although what I find really fascinating is, if we look back over the last 30 or 40 years of research in AI, and one of the things that we find in general is that models, mathematical models of complex decision tasks generally outperform humans. Yeah. But a combination of a human expert with a model generally outperforms the model alone. And one of the reasons for that is because the underlying statistics really are very sensitive to certain subtleties, but they often miss conditions under which the previous data don't really apply.
Yeah.
So for example, if you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, the models really would have had a hard time predicting the way that our stock markets went off a cliff in
Right.
March,
Yeah.
because the previous data didn't have anything in it that would have predicted that. But anyone who was able to pay attention to the the implications that the pandemic was having could actually make that prediction. And so there's a case where you want to say, hey, let's not go with just the modeled data. Let's actually step in and intervene in that case.
Yeah, I want to touch on that in one of your recent papers. But before we get into it, I want to talk about one other one, structural comparison and consumer choice. Where you say psychological research has demonstrated important parallels between the structural alignment process involved in judgments of similarity and the processes that are involved in analogical reasoning. So what's structural alignment in this
Yeah.
context?
Yeah, this was actually kind of a fun project for me because it was one of the first times that I was able to bring together two different aspects of the work that I did. So early in my research career, I spent a lot of time trying to understand how people make comparisons. And one of the things that emerged from that work is this idea that the knowledge that we have isn't just some list of features of things.
Mm.
You know, so if we look at a bird, for example, we don't just say, well, it sings and it's got feathers and it's got legs. What we do is actually structure that so that so that our knowledge actually tells us that, you know, that we have legs, and those legs are meant for locomotion, for walking, that the wings are meant for flying, that the head has sensory organs on it, and so there's all of these interconnections.
Yeah.
And the reason that that's valuable is that it's what enables us to make some very subtle and complex comparisons, so that if I were to compare let's say an airplane to a car, even though airplanes and cars both have wheels, I tend to focus on matching up the wings of the airplane to the wheels of the car, because they're the thing that really facilitates the way that this thing is supposed to move.
Yeah.
And so that structure is what enables us to do that. And what's fascinating about that process is that it tends to lead us both to, when we make a comparison, what things have in common, as well as the differences that relate to what they have in common.
Mm.
And those differences are called alignable differences. So, for example, you might say a plane has wings and a car has wheels.
Right.
Now that's an alignable difference, because what I've done is to decide that these things need to be placed in correspondence because of their function, but they differ. And what's interesting is that we often discount or fail to pay attention to elements of one of the options that don't have a particular correspondence in the other. So, you know, planes have flight attendants and cars don't. You know, and you just tend not to think of that. You know,
Right.
it becomes hard. And so then you could say, well, so this is something that emerges out of research on how people make judgments that things are similar, that how they make these comparisons. And that was actually stuff that I did back when I was a graduate student with my graduate advisor, Dedry Gentner. But one of the things that we began to think about is, well, why does this matter? And one of the reasons it matters is because when you make decisions among sets of things, you often make those decisions on the basis of comparisons of the options.
Right.
And what we were able to demonstrate over a series of different studies that I did, some with Doug Medine, who was another one of my graduate advisors, and some with Shi Zhang, who was a graduate student of mine, who's now a professor at UCLA. We were able to show that in most situations, when you make comparisons of of options, you focus on these alignable differences, these elements where there's a corresponding aspect for each of the options, and you discount unique properties of one of the options that the other one doesn't have. And you don't even realize you're doing this. You don't notice you're doing that. And as a result, a particularly important feature of something that doesn't have a correspondence with the other options will not get as much weight as it ought to get when you're making choices.
Right. Yeah. So this is one of the reasons, Art, I think, we continue to, I shouldn't say fail, but not reach anywhere in AI to get anywhere close to human level of thinking. We have a very messy wiring diagram in the brain, and it's doing a lot of different things we don't quite understand. It's not just a deep neural network as we have portrayed in technology. But I was also thinking that the way that the brain functions in this context, really, as you say, looking for similarities or looking for lack of similarities, and then make a judgment. It's not really storing features, but it is storing history. And so would you say, how you make a judgment is a function of culture, right? So you have to have similar artifacts or non-similar artifacts from history to reach that judgment. And you may have different artifacts in different cultures, right? So it will be really difficult to sort of mechanistically draw out the decision process. And I think that is why we continue to fail in that area.
Yeah, I think that's right. But what's interesting to me too is if you look at the introduction of new products, every once in a while you say, wow, this product was really ahead of its time. And you could ask yourself, what in the world does that mean, that a product is ahead of its time? And if it's such a great product, shouldn't everyone want to use it? But part of what it means is that the knowledge of most of the consumers in that culture at that time doesn't have enough things in it that are similar to the product you're introducing that they can really internalize quickly what its benefits are. And so often what you find is that when a product hits its time, it's because people are aware enough or understand enough about what that product could bring to them because of other bridging technologies that now they're ready to accept it. And so you have to, if you create a product that is ahead of its time, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, in order to get this accepted by people, what is the work that I need to do to prepare them to understand why this is something that they're going to find attractive?
Yeah, so that goes into the marketing communication that you talk about here. It's quite interesting. If I remember correctly, Art, when Lexus and Infiniti was about to come out, I don't know when this was, maybe early 1990s or something like that. They had totally different marketing approaches to it. Infiniti, if I remember correctly, never showed the car. It showed, sort of basically artifacts or images that shows high levels of innovation. Whereas Lexus was, I believe, was more mechanistic in terms of showing the features and so on. And so when you're introducing a new product, I think this is two totally different approaches to it, right? And maybe there is a mathematical basis why one would succeed compared to the other.
Yeah, it's an interesting question too. I mean, some of it also has to do with, as a marketer, you have a certain amount of flexibility in trying to determine what the basis of comparison is, and depending on how you set up that basis of comparison, you can make it easier or harder for people to accept the product. And so one of the dangers, for example, I mean, Lexus and Infiniti had a particular problem, which is that they were these luxury brands that were extensions of existing brands that people didn't generally think of as being particularly luxurious.
Right.
and but at the same time, they were being introduced at a price point that came in below some of the brands that were clearly seen as luxury brands.
Mm-hmm.
So they were intended to get people to take a step up from Toyota and Nissan,
Right.
but not necessarily to be, at least initially, a successful competitor to Mercedes-Benz.
Right.
And so the balancing act that they had to go through was, how do you make sure that people don't view these new brands as just another version of a Toyota or Nissan, but at the same time, not create the sense that if you're going to step up to a Lexus or Infiniti, maybe what you really should be doing is stepping all the way up to a Mercedes.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and so that was, I think over the years, they have of course changed the quality of those brands in ways that they are more significant competitors to Mercedes and BMW and some of those cars, but they had this very interesting balancing act that they had to go through. And I think that what you saw in your, as you were talking about those strategies, were different ways of trying to avoid the direct comparison back to the parent companies,
Yeah.
while also not necessarily inviting a strong comparison to the known luxury brands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really a tough act.
Yeah.
So let me jump into one of your recent papers, Art. I don't know if it is published or not, combining the strengths of naturalistic and laboratory decision-making research to create integrative theories of choice.
Yeah.
I guess it's published, right? So
yeah, that one did come out. Yeah.
Okay. So you said naturalistic decision-making research contrasts with traditional lab research along a number of dimensions. It's typically more observational, more focused on expert performance, and more attentive to the context in which decisions are made than lab studies. So you're basically saying, there are two types of ways we could think about analyzing decision-making processes. One is more mechanistic in the lab, a lot of data, a lot of people, and really looking at how humans behave. And the other is outside the lab, where you're actually looking at real life situations and real experts, but only few of them making decisions. And so I think you're arguing these are complementary things that you might be able to integrate together.
Yeah. That was the idea. So I was invited to kind of create a paper that other people in the research fields could react to. And I think, the idea is, for example, if we think about a few of the early studies in our podcast that we talked about, those were very much laboratory kinds of studies, right? So you had a small number, people are choosing two options that are one of which is rewarded 70% of the time. That's not something we do most of the time in our real lives. But what those kinds of studies enable us to do is to distill a particular question down to an essence, and then test a whole bunch of people on it in order to be able to assess what's going on. So there's a lot of experimental power in that. There's a lot of ability to really say that we understand why people did what they did. So in scientific language, we would say that that's all stuff that has high internal validity.
Yeah.
But it has low what's called external validity, meaning it's really hard to find situations in which people do something exactly like that out in the world. And naturalistic decision-making research tends to go in the opposite direction. So it tends to look at expert performance in situations that are either analyses of decisions that people actually made, or they create conditions that look very much like the expert decisions that are made, and they walk experts through those scenarios and get them to talk about some of the things that drove their decision and to really dig into the details of what they did. The thing about naturalistic decision-making research is it has very high external validity. It's clear when these things happen, but it's a little bit harder to know exactly why they happened, because you don't really have the opportunity to manipulate things in the way that you do in more rigorously designed laboratory studies. And so there's a trade-off between the two of those. And my feeling is that just like you want to have variability in personality characteristics, you want to have variability in the way that you approach your research. You'd like to make sure that you do a certain number of studies for which you can say very clearly, this is what caused this result. But at the same time, you also don't want to lose sight of what people do out in the world. Because a lot of times, and I'm sure you've found this with all of the work you do with your podcast, that every once in a while you talk to a scientist who is studying something, and for if your life depended on it, you'd have a hard time figuring out when this would happen in the real world. And I think that we need that balance as researchers. We need to keep our eye on the fact that we're ultimately trying to explain things that happen in the world. And so we need to go back and forth between those lenses in order to do it effectively.
Yeah. So, when I was reading the paper, Art, I was thinking about, I come from sort of the corporate world. So I have seen 50 or so large companies from both inside and outside. And the why part of what you mentioned of a decision maker's process, right? How did they get to that decision? It's often cited as an example or as a reason that good decision makers have very high compensation, and people say that is proof enough that they make good decisions. Now, my experience has been that if you ask a quote unquote good decision maker to sort of describe the process, he or she cannot or would not. And there's a little bit of a principal agent problem there, because decision makers' incentive is to convince the capital provider that he or she is a good decision maker regardless. And hence describing it in detailed terms is not necessarily a good thing. But generally my bias is to say, when there is a lot of uncertainty, humans are not very good decision makers. Even naive machine learning algorithms could overperform human decision makers. I just let you react to that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, and I think what I would say is the quantitative models are particularly good in situations of uncertainty where the decision is very constrained. So for example, if I had to do stock picking,
yes,
I would really much rather have a model do that for me than a human.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of quantitative variation, and frankly, it's that subtlety is something that people would have difficulty with, and we would also have difficulty with, overweighting recent history when we're really interested in a long-term trend. But the thing about stock picking is it's a pretty constrained choice, meaning there's a certain number of options, and we have a certain amount of history about each of those options.
Yeah.
So let me contrast that with, I've spent the last 6 months heading the academic working group for planning for the fall semester for the University of Texas.
That would have an experience.
And it was an incredible experience.
Yeah.
It was, but it's tremendous amounts of uncertainty.
Yeah.
But also we had to construct the options along the way. We had to determine what might best practices look like in a novel environment. And to what degree do we have to hold certain classes remotely using online platforms versus in person in highly constrained ways that try to keep people safe. And so there were so many dimensions to this decision, and they had to be addressed by a range of experts in ways that there just wouldn't have been a good set of underlying models, because what we were doing was something that was unprecedented. So we couldn't just project from a long-term data set. And so to me, those are both conditions of great uncertainty, but one of them is, I think, much better suited to mathematical models, and the other is much better suited to human interaction.
Yeah. So I wonder, if you would make a distinction between planning and decision. So, if you think about decisions, I'm saying, you're given a set of options and you're asked to pick one. And we see that problem in both ends of the spectrum. You think about high frequency trading. We can demonstrably show machines are a lot better than humans. Humans destroy alpha by sitting in front of a computer and trading, whether it's high
Yeah.
frequency or not. And we see that on the other end of the spectrum too. Think about pharmaceutical R&D process, where you are making decisions on products that take 15 years from idea to market. Even there, we don't really see good evidence that humans are good decision makers. And there's a horizon problem there too, which is, if I'm a senior level in a pharmaceutical company, my horizon I'm trying to maximize is really, 5, 6, 10 years. And, my decisions are not going to be held against me because the portfolio is going to materialize 15, 20 years down the road. So there is a horizon problem there too.
Yes.
But generally speaking, my observation has been that when there is uncertainty, when there is a group of uncertainties that interact with each other, humans tend to fail in that environment.
Yeah, I think so another way to say this is, when there is a clear consideration set, meaning there is a set of options, and where there is significant uncertainty, and there's sufficient data relating to each of the options, then models are often superior, in part because many of the motivational factors that humans have that drive our day-to-day actions don't really benefit the decision process.
Right.
And also in some number of those decision tasks, you don't have to adapt the decision on the fly. Meaning, if I make a particular choice to purchase a particular stock, then, at time 2, when I make my next trading decision, the state of the world is just, now I have this portfolio and there's this data in the world. And so I'm not necessarily recovering from that past decision. I'm just making the next decision given this state of the world.
Right.
And models, I think, do very well in those situations. And where I think people are good is if we have to construct the set of options. But it's not just the decision process. It's also that there are some complex decision processes where the decision itself is, we're going to start off in this direction and adapt on the fly. And so there are many decision settings in which the decision and planning process are so deeply interleaved that what you need to do is to have people think of it as essentially a continuous iterative planning process with periodic decisions being made. And that's a place where humans can do quite well.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So the argument in the paper art is that there are complementarity between, taking a real business or real decision makers making real decisions and making that as a lab, so to speak, a real lab, compared to, sort of constructed lab data. And they're complementary data. So if we can combine that in some systematic way, we might get better insights, right?
That's right. And it's also, I think, a plea. Many of the researchers who do naturalistic decision-making research tend not to do laboratory research and vice versa. And so part of this is an invitation or a plea for those individuals to collaborate with each other and to expand their own research by taking into account these other perspectives, because I think it would broaden and benefit both communities to do that.
Yeah. I want to jump into another paper. This is entitled "Strategies for Economic Development Outside the Urban Corridors." This is increasingly more relevant in the context of COVID. You say small communities and isolated cities have lagged behind larger urban areas in economic development, and also in research that illuminates how economic development can be promoted. And this gap would not be a problem if the principles of prosperity were the same inside and outside of urban corridors, which is not, you can see in the data. And so you're looking at a few examples, right?
Mhm.
Northwest Arkansas as an example, for instance, in this context. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So this is, it's funny. I mean, so here we've talked about all these laboratory studies, but I do believe in looking inside and outside the lab. And a year and a half ago, I was lucky enough to become the executive director of the IC2 Institute, which is a think tank at the University of Texas that has always focused on economic development. For a long time, it was focused on technology and technology commercialization, and played a role in helping Austin, Texas, to go from being a sleepy college town in the 1970s to being a major player in technology as it is today.
Yeah.
But as director, one of the things that we that I did was to work with our faculty and the researchers at the Institute to think about new problems that really desperately need to be solved. And thinking about what's going on outside of these urban areas just seems to be of incredible importance in the United States and around the world. And there's just not a lot of research on that, as you were pointing out in your introduction to this. So what we really wanted to do is to ask the question, what strategies need to be used to help these regions develop, and what could be done to help that? And one of the areas that we studied with the help of the folks from the Walton Family Foundation was to look at some of the things that are going on in the Northwest Arkansas region, which centers on towns like Bentonville and Fayetteville. And what's interesting there is communities, when left to themselves, and we see this in many of the communities in Texas, for example, when left to themselves, they tend to focus on, how do I develop the economy inside of the borders of my community? Mm-hmm. And so how could I attract a factory, or how could I help this small business to grow in my community?
And that's a small area and small population.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to create sustained economic growth inside of a single small town. What's easier to do is to create that kind of growth by having communities collaborate with each other. But it's hard to get the political will to make that happen. And what Northwest Arkansas did that was actually quite interesting was that Sam Walton, the head of Walmart, got a group together to create what is now called the Northwest Arkansas Council, which is a kind of informal governing body that promotes regional development. And so over the years, they did infrastructure projects to benefit the region, building up a network of roads between the communities that would make it easier for people to get from one place to another, building even parks and trails that interconnect the communities, and also to promote having each of the communities within the region think of how they might contribute in a way that doesn't compete directly with the other communities. So, for example, some of those communities, Fayetteville, for example, which is the home of the University of Arkansas, many of the retail and service businesses cater to younger people, and particularly college-age folks. Mm-hmm. And so if you are a college-age type person in any of the communities in Northwest Arkansas, Fayetteville's your destination. Mm-hmm. Whereas Bentonville, if you go to downtown Bentonville, it's organized around a town square that caters to young families. And so, there's a great record store, for example, that if you got kids and you want to buy a cool piece of music, it's not a huge purchase, but it's the kind of thing that you might enjoy. That they have amenities like that in Bentonville. And so the idea is that the various communities built up their retail and service environments to cater to particular demographic groups rather than trying to compete for everybody, which would have meant that no one of those communities would have succeeded particularly well. And they've done the same sort of thing with larger business, but that's kind of a nice example of how they created a compatible set of businesses.
Yeah. So the characteristics here are, so you have to have, it sounds to me, some kind of a governance system, that sort of pulls everything together. You have to have an infrastructure that ties everything together. And then the city planning aspects of this has to be different, right? It has to allow specialization.
Yes.
Regional specialization. So it's almost like a design problem.
Yeah.
If done properly, could have great value.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that's different about smaller communities relative to big cities is that I often joke when talking with people about this, that in a big city or a town the size of Austin, Texas, if you want to get something done, you just have to create what you could call the coalition of the willing. So you just find somebody who's interested in doing it and you work with them. But if you're in a small town or in a small region, you have to find the coalition of whoever's there,
right?
Because you don't have the luxury of being able to find someone else who might have a set of skills if one person turns you down, which means you really have to rely on your people skills, on your ability to negotiate effectively and to really understand the other person's needs and to create more of a relationship with people who you might be able to ignore if both of you were residents of a big city. And so it really does put a lot of these soft skills to the forefront in a way that you can avoid sometimes if you're in a bigger city.
Yeah, so there is also sort of a critical size problem here, right? So you need to get to that sort of a minimum efficient scale, so to speak.
That's right.
And when you reach there, you get talent influx, you get other things that need to come into that area for that to work. From a sustainable perspective, you have another case in here, Art, which I find fascinating, which is northern Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a place you don't want to go. If it's minus 2 degrees centigrade average temperature, something like that. So how did that happen?
Yeah, that's a fascinating place. They've had a tremendous amount of success at economic development, but part of the reason for that is because they've taken advantage of some of the factors that you might think of as being drawbacks. So as you point out, the average daily temperature for the year is minus 2 degrees centigrade. That's cold.
Yeah.
But there are certain industries for which cold is a benefit. And so they've actually managed to become one of the largest locations in Europe for server farms.
Yeah.
Because now you don't have to locate it somewhere and do a lot of air conditioning. You just need to let the hot air out, and things cool off. So it's they've taken advantage of some of that. But one of the other things that they've done quite well, and this is what I like about this is it's a nice contrast to Northwest Arkansas. They don't have an overall governing council.
Yeah.
What they do have is several individuals who have decided that regional collaboration is critical. And so one of the other success stories there is that region has become home to Northvolt batteries, which is one of the largest manufacturers of rechargeable batteries. And what they did, Northvolt had actually approached Luleå, which is one of the towns in that region, and Luleå said, we don't locate your factory here. And so they actually sent the factory to a neighboring community, but then set up a collaboration among communities so that other communities would provide housing and logistics and other support for the factory, and really turned it into a regional win. And that really required a vision, because if you were approached as an economic development person and somebody said, yeah, we want to put this large factory in your town, your first reaction generally isn't, no, why don't you go to one of our neighboring communities?
Yeah.
But if you really think about what the benefit of that factory is for the region,
Yeah.
you might actually recognize that your particular town is actually better suited to play a slightly different role once that business locates to the region, at which point you may actually create a much more sustainable development. But it requires people with vision, and it requires people who are really willing to work together and to trust each other, that if you recommend another community get this factory, that they're going to work back with you to make sure that you get some good development as well.
Yeah. So, this is so interesting. We have, I think, something like 60 million people, about 20% of our population in sort of rural areas. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
In the US?
That's correct. Yeah.
So, in conclusion, Art, based on your research, are there certain parameters that you believe will make this more successful? What I mean by parameters, a number of different types of towns, their populations, their distance from each other. Are there parameters that are that make them more successful? And if so, have you done any research around how many of that 60 million people could benefit from this type of an arrangement?
Yeah, I think that actually we live at a very interesting time right now, because I believe that the task that was facing these smaller communities was much more difficult 3 years ago than it might be right now, because one of the ways to see this is that over the last 30 years, one of the trends in business has been towards optimizing supply chains, optimizing logistics, getting everything as cheaply as possible, and doing a lot of just-in-time manufacturing. And what that does is to drive down costs, which is a benefit to the consumer, but it does it at the cost of resilience.
Yeah.
So a shock to the supply chain can create shortages and other significant problems. So there's been the well-publicized discussions about the run on toilet paper in March.
Yeah.
And the observation that really emerged from the fact that there are two different supply chains for toilet paper.
Right.
One that's a consumer-based supply chain, and one that's a commercial-based, and that when everyone started working from home, it taxed the consumer-based supply chain, and the commercial supply chain wasn't needed.
Right.
So it was a resilience problem. And I think that what that tells us is that there's going to be more appetite over the next decade for creating more redundancy in the supply chain, having a little bit more local control over manufacturing and logistics. And that's precisely the sort of thing that a lot of small communities are going to be able to participate in. And so I think actually there's a real opportunity right now. In order for that to work, though, and this gets back to your question about parameters, there are several problems that need to be solved. And one of those problems is a workforce development problem, which means, the regions that have access to a 4-year college or a community college that can help to train and retrain workers is going to be crucial, and to make that a regional hub of education.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be one issue. Another issue that's going to be incredibly important is that another difference between Sweden and the United States is that in Sweden, healthcare and broadband access both lead the market. The government provides insurance on healthcare and promotes the development of broadband access, even in rural regions.
Right.
Whereas in the United States, both healthcare and broadband tend to lag the market.
Mm.
So until there's a market for a hospital, you don't get a hospital.
Right.
Until there's a need for high-speed broadband, you don't get it in the region. And that makes it more difficult for our smaller communities to develop. And I think one of the other things that's going to happen is that communities are going to have to work with local governments and other regional authorities to create more of a pull for both broadband access and medical care, because it's just hard to get a workforce to move to a region if the nearest hospital is 100 miles away. So those are some issues that are going to have to be addressed, because the access to good health care is really important for people as a place to live. And then I think the third parameter that's really important is a willingness for the region to sit down and figure out how they could collaborate on an industry. So are they going to be the manufacturing center, the logistics center, the warehousing center, are they going to be providing an interface among firms? Those are the kinds of things where I think you can get a certain amount of specialization in a particular community that requires collaboration. And what's fascinating to me is that collaboration is extraordinarily difficult to come by. So, for example, we've done some studies up in Keene, New Hampshire. And Keene is an interesting place. They've got a lot of precision manufacturing firms that have been there for 50 years. They are also home to one of the largest supermarket logistics companies, a company that sends groceries to grocery stores all around the country.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is those two entities are largely independent within the community, meaning that they're aware of each other, but they don't work on anything together. And yet, if you think of it with another lens, you could imagine a company that has strength in national logistics actually trying to collaborate with companies that have manufacturing expertise to say, well, what if we had a wing that actually assisted these precision manufacturing companies in the distribution of their goods around the country? That might actually make the town even more attractive for additional manufacturing. And so I think that there are ways of looking at those hidden resources, sort of like Sweden looked at its cold temperatures, and using those as a way of jumpstarting additional economic development.
Yeah. So, it sounds to me, Art, that what you're saying is that there has to be certain initial conditions for this to work. So,
yes,
education, workforce development. There has to be, and similarly, healthcare and information infrastructure that Sweden has done extremely well.
Yeah.
And so what that tells me is that do you think this needs some sort of a seeding program from a national level? So you can go out and analyze the 60 million people, and you can come up with, I would imagine, 50 communities that sort of fit the geographical aspects of it, but they cannot move into this idea without some seed capital. And rather than sending everybody stimulus checks, which might be needed, this might be a much sustainable stimulus, to the organization, to the community, right?
Yeah.
And I also see, from you said, it's not like this will be an emergent phenomena, it sounds to me. So if you set the initial conditions, you kind of step back and say things will work out. Not necessarily, because you sort of need a strategic plan that says, this is how specializations could evolve and how they could collaborate and how the whole system could work. And so that goes back to the governance, the requirement for, some kind of a governance that does that strategic plan for them.
That's correct. And just to amplify two things that you're saying there. I mean, I think one is, the development of any kind of economic ecosystem is going to require collaborations between business and government and universities. I think those are crucial legs to the stool. And one of the problems that smaller communities have is that they often don't have a lot of expertise around strategic planning.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, one of the things that the IC2 Institute does is to try to provide training for that. We've actually got a program that we're firing up in the fall of here in the fall of 2020, where that's called Regional Accelerate. That is a strategic planning course for communities and regions to think in this way, precisely because a lot of times in small towns, the person who's mayor is just the person whose turn it was to be mayor right now. It's not someone who envisioned being a career politician. And so, they may be a great local business person or a young professional, but they're not necessarily somebody steeped in governance. And so we want to help to provide some additional education and resources to help those communities to do that better.
Right. Yeah, excellent. This has been great. Thanks so much for spending time with me, and good luck with this very important work that you're doing from IC2.
Well, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure talking with you, and it's always fun to talk about that interplay between the basic research that gets done and the way that it can get applied out in the world.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.